Welcome to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. Hope you're having a great day as we continue to celebrate all the people across the great state of Mississippi who are working so hard in the trenches to make this such a great place to live, work, and play. Listen, if you go back in recent shows, if there is a theme of my show, and I often say that, I mean, obviously I talk about living in the moment. That's important that we live in the moment. We can't do a darn thing about yesterday. We can only plan for tomorrow, but we need to live in the moment and we need to do it with gusto. So that's certainly a theme, but there's another theme that emerges over and over and again, and that is the role that volunteers play in our community. In a recent conversation with Mayor Billy Knight, who is widely respected here in coastal Mississippi, the mayor of Moss Point, we talked about that. We talked about what we learn about our fellow citizens when we're out in the community doing our work. Casey Vaughn, the mayor of Gaucher, and I had that conversation. And just about every time that Paige Roberts or Adele Lyons or Tish Williams from the Chambers on the coast, Cynthia as well from the Ocean Springs Chamber, this notion of volunteers continues to come back over and over again. And I think that the thing that I always want to drive home is that one of the reasons why we're so resilient, it doesn't just speak to what we do after natural disasters, major tornadoes or floods or something like Hurricane Katrina, but it really speaks to the role that volunteers play every single day, day in and day out, to fill gaps in the community, to help us be stronger. Because at the end of the day, and I believe this to the depths of my soul, we will only be as strong as our weakest link. And I think that we are so lucky in Mississippi, and I think national surveys bear this out, that we have so many people who are willing to get in the thick of it, to get into the trenches and work hard to build better communities. Some of them are doing it as it relates to young people who need help. Some of them are doing it to help build better communities. Some of them are doing it in a wide number of nonprofits and other organizations, churches that are focused on helping people, in some cases, that can't help themselves. One theme of the show, though, that I keep coming back to, and I haven't talked about it in a while, it's one that I want to continue to focus on, is the issues related to domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, especially, and other areas around that area of our society. And we're lucky that we have organizations in this state. Again, I always mention churches, but other organizations that are working hard to fill gaps, to help people who are in need. And there are a lot of people across the state who have needs. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to invite Sandy Middleton, who's the executive director for the Center for Violence Prevention here in Mississippi, to join me today. I wanted to get to know Sandy better. I want to understand her organization better. But you know what? The notion or the issue around human trafficking is a real one. And as I've said oftentimes, that it could be it could be something that you think in your mind's eye that happens in Africa, but it can also happen next door, as I often remind people. But we're gonna talk about a wide range of issues. But I wanted you to get to know the Center for Violence Prevention here. She's been a regular on some of the other SuperTalk shows, but she's not had the opportunity to join me for literally a full show talking about their areas of influence and what we might be able to do to help them. So without any further ado, let me welcome my new friend. I've enjoyed talking to her before the show started, Sandy Middleton. Sandy, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's so good to be with you.
Well, I saw you as I was speaking to one of the reasons Mississippi is lucky and fortunate about the volunteers who are willing to work in the trenches and do a wide range of community service efforts to help us. But that's true, isn't it? I mean, we can never have enough volunteers, but boy, we have a big heart, don't we?
Absolutely. And I know here at the Center for Violence Prevention, we count heavily on our community and our volunteers. And anytime we're in any kind of need, we always laugh and say we can post on social media that we need a bicycle or or a crate full of toilet paper, and it comes. So and we're so grateful for that. Not to mention the support we get from people like you, shows like yours, law enforcement, just across the board. We're grateful. Mississippi's a great place to be especially when you're in need, for sure.
Listen, we're gonna talk in this conversation. I want to learn more about your organization, human trafficking, the role the center plays in violence prevention, the collaboration and partnerships. I mean, you just mentioned law enforcement, but they're really important partners, other NGOs, churches. We'll get into some of that. I want to end with at least a pretty in-depth conversation about what the call to action is and how people, listeners, and others can help you in your efforts. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how people can get more information from your organization. So we're going to cover the waterfront, but I also want to get to know you. So where are you from?
Well, I'm actually a Louisiana girl, and born in Shreveport. My dad was a Baptist preacher, so we moved all around, lived all over Louisiana and Mississippi. So I appreciate your Louisiana connections and your time down there. And so, just grew up in a very a Christian home, a home where service and commitment was taught and expected, and I wound up here a little over 20 years ago, and it was a God thing, as I say. I mean, I was doing a political and nonprofit consulting and fundraising, and I saw where this place was pretty much closed down, and so I reached out and brought some friends along, and we raised a lot of money, and then my heart just, how you just feel connected to a place, and so we wound up here, and I never dreamed that I'd be here this long, but I've done some cool things in my career, but this is the most important and by far the most meaningful.
No, that's good to hear. We'll talk about your board here in just a second, but I'm just curious about what keeps you going. I mean, you obviously, you said you've been about 20 years there. When you wake up in the morning, what's that sense of purpose that keeps you going? What is it you see in your daily work that says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I'm here"?
That's a great question. And I think, in the director role, unfortunately, I spend a lot of time in my office paying bills, doing payroll, HR, that kind of stuff. We've got a big facility, and, so there's always something broken. There's a car that's got a flat, one of our clients. There's just all these plethora of needs every day that just come at you, from every direction, whether it's client needs or agency needs or staff needs. And so I think, in this role, it really has to be a calling. I mean, it's certainly more than a job. And I mean, that's kind of what is it, the Navy that says that? It's more than a job, it's an experience, something like that. Yeah. So, I think, and to see our clients, particularly our human trafficking clients who they're so amazingly resilient. The work they put into recovery, they're so inspirational. Just to spend time with them every day. I had the good fortune to spend time with one of them yesterday. We did SuperTalk Jackson and had her on the show with me, and I just found myself sitting next to her. We kept her off the video, off the screen, but I found myself just sitting and watching her and the change and the growth, and it's just such a blessing to see people recover. And it's such a long, difficult road because of the trauma they've experienced. It's trauma that you and I can't fathom. We can't even understand how a human being can survive that sort of trauma. And so, I'm just really amazed by our clients every day, and so impressed. And, so for me, that just spending a little time with them, seeing them in the morning when I've come through, and, their smiles and their determination, it just does it for me.
Well, that's a good one. I recall early in my career at the Sun Herald, I had the opportunity to go to work as a volunteer for a program at the Harrison County Youth Court called Volunteers in Probation. And so what we did, I mean, it's like a kind of a big brother thing. They would match us up with young people who had some difficulties in their lives, and we would just spend some time with them and talk to them and be on the other side of the phone if they needed to talk to us. And I did that for like 7 years actually. And the longer I did it, the more difficult the young people became. In other words, their cases were difficult, and they had done some things that were tough. But I found them very similar to the ones I worked with early on. Very innocent, very much a victim of the environments they were in. And what some of those young people had to go through, Sandy, I don't have to tell you, but I never forgot it. And it may be one of the reasons why, as a young father and now a grandfather, I loved coaching. I loved spending time with and trying to do everything I could to influence them. Hey, when we get back on the other side, we're going to continue our conversation with Sandy Middleton from the Center for Violence Prevention. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank studio. Really appreciate you joining us today as we talk about a quote that is on the Center for Violence Prevention's website. As we talk about this point, we believe everyone has the right to a life free of violence. And this is an organization, the Center for Violence Prevention, that is really, really focused on that. So we're going to take a bit of a step back now and talk to you about this organization. She talked about all the things you have to do. Listen, being the executive director of an organization like you are, you gave that plethora of things that might come at you in any given day. There's a very unsexy part of the work, and that is you got kind of a business to run, even though it's a nonprofit, and there's a lot that can tug at you. But when you look at your mission, tell me, if you're just giving someone the elevator speech on what the Center for Violence Prevention is all about, how do you talk about it?
Well, we have multiple programs to assist victims in their recovery, whether you're talking about domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking. And we have a lot of really cool components under each one of those programs. But they're all client-centered, they're all trauma-informed, and we don't just use a lot of people talk about trauma informed, and we don't just throw those words around. I mean, we mean it. And, so we do a lot of work systemically. I mean, we're working with our legislators on some bills right now. We've kind of focused on the issues we're having with our sexual assault clients and trying to get our hands around the rape kits and things like that. And so we're active systemically as well as on the ground, meeting victims where they are and helping them in any way we can for them to recover.
So you actually, as you mentioned, you have a physical facility. So what happens there?
Well, we have two shelters. We have one shelter called the Beacon. That's our emergency shelter for domestic violence and sexual assault victims. It's a short-term stay. It's an emergency shelter where they can come, but they get all of the components of service that we have: case management, advocacy, therapy. We have an in-house therapist. We have legal advocacy. Anything those clients need. We also have 2 transitional housing programs that, when they finish here, they can roll into transitional housing. Then we have our Bridge Forensic Clinic, which our Bridge is our sexual assault program. And we're one of the few in the country that we actually have our own clinic. We have a nurse practitioner and we have an actual forensic clinic, just like CSI. I mean, we have about 5 sexual assault nurse examiners who are on staff. And so when the victims in the Metro Jackson area, when they present to an emergency room here in the Metro area, it's one of our sayings that responds to the ER to do the forensic kit and to assist the victim. And then one of our advocates also joins them. So that's really key in being able to, number one, take care of these victims, make sure they've got the medical help they need, and then make sure that any DNA evidence is gathered so that they'll have access to justice. And that's, we can talk more about that if you want to, but that's been a real issue in our state. But the Bridge Forensic Clinic is really new, and it's quite unusual for a nonprofit to have that situation. So we also have the tower. We opened the tower in 2017 to meet the need of human trafficking victims, and it has two components. We have a long-term residential program here where they can stay up to 2 years. We work on recovery. We have multiple different therapeutic modalities. We do equine therapy, we do yoga, we do mindfulness, all of that. And then we have a pretty extensive educational workforce program where they can learn a trade. Because, if they can't learn to support themselves and their children, then they're going to wind up vulnerable again, which is what put them in the place they were to begin with. So that's a huge part of the program. And then also the Center for Violence Prevention is charged with rapid response advocates across the state. So we have 10 certified human trafficking advocates, rapid response advocates who live all over the state. You've got one on the coast, there's one in the Hattiesburg area, and we work hand in hand with law enforcement. We're there physically present when there's an operation. If law enforcement does a sting or an operation, we're there. We bring our medical team. We're prepared right then and there to meet whatever need that client has or that victim has. And so it's and then we also run a batter's intervention program. We have a secondhand store. That's kind of the high level explanation of
that's very, very good, very detailed, and I can see why what you do is important. You think about, you mentioned, let's come back to DNA, which you said the role you guys play in that evidence collection is a little unusual, maybe a challenge in our state. What I see a benefit, and you can talk a little bit more about it, but the benefit I see of your involvement is in past conversations when I'm dealing with people who are working in the area of supporting women, in some case children, in some case men, who are involved in sexual assault of some sort. The issue of confidentiality and trust is probably one of the most important parts. It's helping the victim really get into their head that they are working with someone who professionally understands confidentiality, et cetera, so that if they were to reach out to you guys, they can trust you, et cetera. But I could see the benefit of you being involved in the process from the very beginning because you're building trust together. I don't know if that is a big part of the overall conversation you guys are having, but I just see that as a benefit.
Well, that's exactly why we started the forensic piece, was because like I said, I've been here 20 years. And when we started our sexual assault program, victims weren't coming to us. We weren't finding them. And so, I'm a business person. And so I look at things, I look at problems and try to find solutions. And so we devised this plan to start being the person that they saw when they presented to the hospital. Because, so many times if it's not handled correctly emergently, and that's with sexual assault and human trafficking, these victims disappear. They aren't prone to report. And especially with human trafficking, their trafficker will move them if there's a chance that, that they can get help. And so because of all these reasons, the emergent response is absolutely absolutely necessary. But that requires a big lift from the agency, because that means our people have to go when they're called, whether it's 2 o'clock in the morning or Christmas Day or whatever. And that's the unusual piece that we have here at the center, is that we have a really high expectation for our staff, and they are super committed. And when I talk about these rapid response advocates that are all over the state of Mississippi, I mean, we literally had a response on Christmas Day, just this past Christmas Day. I mean, she had her family, and she was like, I got a call from law enforcement. They've got a potential victim. And, they roll out, they go. And that also is so awesome, because law enforcement learns also that they can trust us, and that when they need us, we're coming, because they're out there, and people don't think about that a lot. But, law enforcement, they're on the ground all the time, day and night, holidays, weekends, whatever, they're there to respond, and they need help. They need help. They don't have all the answers, and we expect them to work these cases and to do everything they need to do while still trying to engage with the victim. And it's just, they really appreciate the support emergently and in the field. And so it really does mean a lot, both for the systemic response and especially for the victim.
Sandy, you know what's amazing to me? I think, and this is not a political conversation. This is not a political show. I'm dealing with learning about leaders and zeroing in on challenges that we have and talking about how we can build a greater Mississippi. And this is not a political statement. But I'm surprised that when we have a national discussion about the number of kids that have been lost, illegal immigrant children that have been lost in the system, that people either want to minimize that, turn their heads away from it, or say it's not even true. Because every time I have a conversation with anyone who's familiar with the subject, and we'll get to the various forms of human trafficking here in just a second, but every time I get to a conversation about human trafficking and the role that some children play in that, it amazes me what I hear about how bad it can get. And it amazes me to hear, literally, there is a market, literally a market for young children.
Yes.
If there is a stench in our society, that is it. But the fact that people can't focus on it because they believe that politics are somehow skewing this. When we get back on the other side, we'll talk to the realities of human trafficking, and you can talk us, some of the different angles to this. And then we'll talk about, why do big events like the Super Bowl, for example, why do they create a significant increase in the incident around this? We'll see you with Sandy Middleton on the other side. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. We're visiting today with Sandy Middleton, and she's the Executive Director for the Center for Violence Prevention. And when we went to break, we talked about human trafficking. But before we continue that conversation, I just want to make an observation, Sandy, and you can, I'll just get your thoughts about it. As a former publisher who also was a digital media CEO, I was leading in the area of digital news during the time of massive change. I often referred to as the digital tsunami, overcoming traditional media. There's a lot of good to that. There's a lot of bad to that. And we don't even have time. This show is really not about that. But one of the things I think is good about it is that there are people engaged in the conversation around something like human trafficking that before they weren't engaged about. They might have read a story from time to time in the paper, or maybe they saw a news story about it from time to time. But now through X and other social media platforms and other news sources, they can get a more dynamic picture of what's happening. So when they hear, as you and I were discussing before we went to break, that 350,000 or so kids have been lost in the system that were illegal immigrants, they're more aware of that today, and they're more sensitive to, where are those kids? How do we find those kids? What's happening to those kids? Some of them are hung up in labor trafficking. Some of them are hung up in sex trafficking. Some are just lost in the system. They're probably in a good household somewhere. We just don't know where they are. But I see people more engaged in the conversation today than ever. Do you sense that yourself?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's been a lot of talk about, the border and the lost kids and all of that. And I think too that, we get the tips on the kids and everything. And we've seen a actual decrease in the number of tips that we're receiving, but the tips are more authentic. They're more dependable. And I think that's because people like you raising the awareness and in the beginning, and of course we've been at this, like I said, since 2017, and we got in it initially because we kept having these situations that didn't fit into either domestic violence or sexual assault, but they had components of both. And we were like, what is this? This is not, this guy isn't her boyfriend, but she calls him her boyfriend. And so, we were so perplexed by all of that we did a lot of research and started doing a lot of training. And we were like, okay, this is human trafficking. So anyway, gosh, I forgot where I was going.
Well, no, that's the point. The point is you're sharing that people are engaged, and because they're more aware that the authenticness of the reports that you're getting are better, and that's what happens when you have awareness. So I think it's a terrific point.
And so we're getting more reports from hospitals and law enforcement. And then, of course, another thing that we were able to do legislatively was to create the certification of human trafficking investigators and advocates. And so, we set up some standards and some trainings, and we put some people responsible for, making sure law enforcement knew what they were looking for. But it had to be more than just the basic training, which is what you just hear over and over again. What is human trafficking? For law enforcement, they need to know, okay, I know what it is, what I do with it. Because it takes some very intense training to learn. I mean, you got, like you were talking about, you got all this digital stuff to deal with, and most of the evidence is digital. How do I get into the phones? How do I get the evidence to be able to move forward? And then it's getting the cooperation of the district attorneys around the state, because primarily they're the ones that need to be prosecuting these cases. So, that whole process, I think, has raised the level of response, and now we're actually doing something about it instead of just saying, hey, I think that was human trafficking. We're doing something about it.
Well, I think also what goes along with this awareness and this education is, if you go back the last several years in the legislature, they've been incredibly receptive to the conversation. So whether you're talking to legislative leadership or specific legislators, they can talk about it today in ways they were never able to talk about it before. It's the same way with the Attorney General. I mean, she is all in on the conversation. So in that respect, having leadership across the state where we can turn on a dime if we need to adjust things or move in a different, or to just refine our approaches, that makes life better for everybody, doesn't it?
100%. Yes. And I'm so grateful for all of that.
So, okay. So what forms does sex trafficking come? I mean, there's sort of this traditional, maybe it's a prostitute or something like that. It could be a neighbor that's got a drug addiction, putting their child out there for some reason or another. But how do you talk about it when you think about the various forms?
Well, we primarily see sex trafficking, and in our rapid response, we respond to both minors and adults. And over the last few months, we've seen about 250 victims, and I think about 60 of those were minors, and we've offered almost 6,000 services to the victims, and that would be across 47 counties in the state of Mississippi. So, we've responded to minors as young as 12 and 13 years old, all the way to adults in their 40s. So it really it really covers such a broad area, and a lot of those kids, well, I was going to say a lot of the adults that we deal with were also trafficked as children. But that's one of the big issues that we're still missing in our state, is being able to look at our kids and the minors that are in the system and recognize the ones who are at high risk. And because if we can identify, okay, because we know that traffickers are looking for vulnerability. They can sense vulnerability, and for all of our kids that are in the foster care system, that are moved around through the system, which we could do a whole show on that and how it drives me crazy. And we don't spend enough time trying to find out from our kids what happened to them. Medicaid pays for everything for these kids, and so the first thing we have to do is get a mental health diagnosis in order to get it paid for. And so then 9 times out of 10 that comes with a pill or 2 or 3, and then that kid just takes ownership of, well, I'm this or I'm that, or there's that mental health diagnosis that follows that child everywhere they go. And so they kind of become desensitized to the fact that they're a victim. These things happen to this child. And so when we ignore that, when it's a child, and then this child grows up then to become an adult, and that everything that's happened to them, it all rolls up. And none of it goes away unless it's appropriately dealt with through trauma therapy. And so, you wind up with these adults that are horribly traumatized. And so, we're seeing situations where they're trafficked by their families. We're seeing gang trafficking, which, young girls on the street, they think, oh, well, I'm going to be a part of this gang and they're going to take care of me. But, it's anybody that's got any kind of gang expertise will tell you that women never rise to the top of gangs. They are the mules. They are committing the petty crimes. And so then a lot of times also these victims get jailed for things that they're forced to do. So then you've got that complication as well. We're seeing some labor trafficking, but I think, as you stated earlier, with all these people coming into the country and, they're hiding and undercover, and it's harder to find them, and it's also harder, to work those cases.
Yeah. So I remember, as I said before we went to break, I remember the show that I was doing a couple of years ago, where the person I was talking to went into great detail about this whole notion of there is a market for a 12-year-old. In my head, it was hard for me to get my head around. Obviously the realist in me sees that pretty clearly, but the father and the person who sees a child and wants to protect their innocence it's like a dichotomy that's working inside myself. But when did you first become aware, and how did it impact you when you saw there literally is a market for a 12-year-old girl?
Well, I think back when we started responding to the operations, law enforcement were doing, and, we would actually be there on site when they were chatting with these buyers, and within seconds, you could buy a little boy through some apps, some computer apps. The same thing for little girls. It just blew my mind that not only was it so easy, but it was so fast and had the demand. We talk about trafficking is all about supply and demand. When you look at it from that standpoint, and there's a tremendous demand of people out there who want to buy sex and to buy it from a child. It's really frightening on where we are.
It is a scary thought. That connects directly to, sadly, the Super Bowl. When we get back on the other side, we're going to chat a little bit more about that angle of the dangle with Sandy Middleton when we get back. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. We're visiting with Sandy Middleton today, who's the Executive Director for the Center for Violence Prevention. And it's a very detailed conversation about the challenges an organization like hers faces, but also why it's important to have an organization like hers. And my gosh, are they filling an important role in the community? We were talking about human trafficking when we went to break, and we're gonna chat a little bit more about the Super Bowl and why, not just the Super Bowl, but why there's a correlation between major events like the Super Bowl and an increase in human trafficking. But I wanted to, for regular listeners, I've actually mentioned this before, but Steve Azar, my friend, who has In a Mississippi Minute on the SuperTalk network, and also wrote the state song One Mississippi, and a very successful singer-songwriter, once wrote a song called The Sky is Falling, and in parentheses it says Patty Joe's Prayer, but The Sky is Falling is the name of the song by Steve Azar. You can see it on YouTube, but it's a terrific song that he wrote about, in his charity efforts, incidentally, about human trafficking. And it's got a hopeful message to it. It's also depressing when you realize what young people have to go through as it relates to this. And that's sort of what we're talking about now. So, Sandy, large events draw people, and the Super Bowl probably is the big one when we talk about human trafficking. But New Orleans is going to have its hands full, and I would say actually the entire Gulf South region surrounding New Orleans as it relates to human trafficking. There are a lot of bad people who have a supply who are willing to provide it because there's a demand. How did we get there as a society?
That's a great question. Probably requires somebody a lot smarter than I am. I mean, just the breakdown of the family and our kids are just, so many kids are just out there on their own. And I don't know. I think for a lot of us, it really caught us off guard. I mean, we really didn't understand where we were until we had an epidemic. We woke up and we were in crisis. And so I think that's probably what's made it worse. But, there's a lot of conversation about the Super Bowl and trafficking. And some experts say, well, we can't really prove that it happens more at the Super Bowl. But of course, as you and I both have the Louisiana ties in common, I mean, there's certainly a plethora of opportunities for bad behavior at the Super Bowl, not to mention when it's in New Orleans. So, there's already a lot of issues in New Orleans anyway. And, then you bring this environment in, and it certainly is an environment ripe for trafficking. I'm hopeful that everybody's ready for it. I mean, I know the federal government and I know Governor Landry has made this a key part of his administration. So, we're just going to hope and pray that people are there and they're paying attention and watching, and that some victims will be recovered.
I think Governor Landry's law enforcement background informs him well.
Yes,
you can tell when he talks as governor that he has been there and done it and seen it with his own eyes. And when you see, and I'm not just talking about sex trafficking, but I'm just talking about anything in the criminal justice domain. He speaks with incredible awareness about what it is. And the other thing is, he's not afraid. He's not afraid to talk about it or to build systems around it and do what needs to be done. He's very practically minded in that regard. So it will be interesting to see how the support organizations like yours might be engaged more around what might happen as it relates to the Super Bowl. But it's a sad statement about our humanity, isn't it?
It truly is. And we have a lot of partnerships down there. And, so we're prepared if we get the call, as always, and we'll respond. And, we'll be there if they need us.
Well, I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I mean, it's I guess the way I would say it, it's an important part of what you're doing, but the need to collaborate, the partnerships that you gain. You just mentioned partners just now, but the role that law enforcement plays and the relationship you have with law enforcement, that part of what you do is super important, isn't it? I mean, you probably have a bunch of NGOs that you're engaged with, and of course the law enforcement community has to know who you are and what you bring to the table. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, that's such a true statement that we do have multiple nonprofits, NGOs, whether they're state government partners or federal government. I mean, I've got access to federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, as does my staff who are out in the field. So, and like I said earlier, they know we're going to come when they call us, and so we have a real good bond with them, and they trust us and they count on us, and we stay in our lane. They do their thing and we do ours, and we're there to help, and that certainly helps build that relationship, and then the partnerships with the other agencies, to be able to say, hey, I have a need, I don't have a bed, who has a bed? And of course, we didn't even talk about the whole addiction issue and what we go through with there's the fentanyl and all of that.
I hate to say this, we're at the end of our time together, Sandy, but what we'll do when we come back together again in a month or so, we'll talk about fentanyl and drugs and all the issues you have to deal with in a given day. And also we'll talk about call for action. How can people get in contact with you? What are the various roles that they can play? We'll just continue the conversation. So to be continued. This has been Sandy Middleton from the Center for Violence Prevention in Mississippi. And listen, have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.